Welcome to Midnight Casebook, where every shadow hides a secret and every mystery begs to be solved. Tonight, we unravel the chilling tale of Father Brown Reads the Dead's Letter, a fan-made story paying homage to the brilliance of G.K., Chesterton's legendary detective. We'd love to have you along for this enigmatic journey. Drop a comment to let us know where you're watching from, share your theories, and if you spot any inconsistencies, don't hesitate to call them out. Your keen eyes and sharp minds help us craft even more captivating mysteries in the future. Chapter 1. Father Brown opens a deadly letter. They said the letter was written in the victim's blood. Yet the victim had died 3 days before it arrived. Father Brown held the envelope between two fingers, as though the paper itself might bite. It was thick, almost damp, and smelled faintly of iron and damp earth. The handwriting on the front was deliberate but crooked, as if each stroke had been made in the dark. No address, no stamp, just his name, in that spidery scrawl, Reverend Brown. The postman swore it hadn't passed through the regular mail, that it had been found wedged into the church door just after dawn, the edges curled with frost. He turned it over slowly, his thumb brushing the faintest smear of something dark near the seal. Not ink. He had seen ink all his life, and this was heavier, clotted, stubborn, the kind of stain you could smell before you could see it. When he broke the seal, the sound was not the crisp crack of paper, but the reluctant tear of something damp. Inside, the folded sheet was stiff and warped, as though it had been soaked in something, and then dried. The letter itself contained only 6 words. Words so plain they should have been harmless. But they were not. They were a sentence, a threat, a confession, and a warning all at once. He read them once, twice, and then a third time. And on the third reading, the back of his neck prickled because he realized the words had been written by someone whose hand he had shaken only yesterday. The church felt different after that. The quiet didn't comfort, it pressed in, as though the air itself was listening. Outside, the frost had not yet melted, but a single crow sat on the iron gate, watching him, head tilted. He tried to think who might know enough to write such a thing, who could craft a message that carried no obvious threat, yet promised something so final. He thought of the townspeople, their polite nods and cautious smiles. He thought of the way some avoided meeting his eyes at all. The truth was, Father Brown had always known that evil rarely arrived with a shout. It came quietly, politely, on the edges of everyday life, hiding behind curtains and respectable facades. Still, as he looked at that letter, a creeping unease wound through him. This was no ordinary crime, no ordinary warning. This was an invitation, one he could not refuse. Without inviting something worse, he decided to trace the paper itself. In the candlelight, faint impressions bled through the sheet, the shadow of another writing, long since erased. Someone had pressed too hard when they wrote on the page before it, leaving ghostly indentations of different words. He tilted it, and the pale curves and lines shimmered into view. One of them was a name, not his own, a woman's name. He knew it well, but he also knew that woman had been buried 6 months ago in a grave no one dared to visit. The knock at the church door was soft, hesitant, but it came before he could look again. He slipped the letter into his coat pocket and opened the door to find no one there, only a small parcel on the step, wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. It was cold to the touch, heavier than it looked. When he unwrapped it, he found a single object inside. A pocket watch, stopped at 11:46, the glass cracked as though it had been stepped on. He recognized it instantly. It had belonged to the same woman whose name had been hidden in the letter. A sound rose in the empty church, faint, like the turning of a key in a lock that had not been touched in years. It came from the vestry. He stepped inside, the wooden boards underfoot sighing with each movement, and then he saw it. An envelope identical to the first, lying open on the vestry table. But this one was addressed to no one. Inside was a single photograph, its edges burned. In the photograph, Father Brown was standing beside the very same woman's grave, except he had no memory of ever being there. The cold in the room thickened. He turned the photo over and found a single sentence, written in the same crooked hand. "You stood where she died." His mind reeled. The woman's death had been declared an accident, a fall near the quarry edge. But this implied something else, something deliberate. He tried to recall every moment he'd seen her, every conversation they'd shared. But already the memories felt tampered with, altered. And why? Why would someone want him to believe he had been at the place of her death? He reached into his coat to compare the handwriting, but the first letter was gone. His fingers brushed only an empty pocket, somewhere between the door and the vestry. It had vanished. Either he had dropped it, or someone had taken it from him without him noticing. The church door slammed in the distance, echoing like a gunshot. He moved toward it, but as he stepped into the nave, the light through the stained glass flickered strangely, the colours shifting as if shadows were moving outside. He was about to open the door when something slid under it, a thin strip of paper torn from an old book. 4 words in the same hand as before. "You have less time." He turned the paper over. On the other side was a fragment of a hymn, but one word had been scratched out so violently that the paper was nearly torn through. He could not see what the word had been. From the corner of his eye, something moved, slow, deliberate, in the far pew. He turned, but the pew was empty, save for a faint outline in the dust where someone had been sitting only moments before. There was a smell lingering there, tobacco smoke, and something else, something metallic. He knew that smell. It was the same that clung to the letter. He felt watched now, not just in the church, but from every angle of thought, as though someone was not only following him, but arranging his steps. The realization came with a cold certainty. This was not a crime to be solved in a day or a week. This was a game, and he had already moved his first piece without knowing. He turned the paper strip over again and again, but the message did not change. His mind, however, began to turn. Less time. For what? To solve the death? To prevent another? Or less time until his own name appeared on one of these letters? The bell in the church tower rang suddenly once without anyone pulling the rope. The sound was so loud it seemed to press the air from the room. When it faded, he realized his hands were clenched around the paper so tightly the edges had bitten into his skin. He opened his fingers and saw, to his astonishment, that the ink on the paper had smudged. Fresh ink, still wet, as if the message had been written only seconds before. And that was when he heard the whisper. Low, close, and meant only for him. "You're reading the wrong letter." He spun toward the voice, but the nave was empty. Only the echo of his own breath returned to him. He looked at the paper again, and now the words were gone. The strip was blank, save for one faint mark in the corner, the outline of a cross drawn in blood. Somewhere beyond the church walls, a carriage rolled away down the frozen road. He thought of chasing it, but his feet did not move, because he knew, deep in the quiet, reasoning part of his mind, that the moment he followed, the game would change again. And the truth, whatever it was, would be buried even deeper. Father Brown closed his eyes and the image of the 6 words from the original letter returned to him. They no longer looked like words at all. They looked like instructions. And he had the terrible feeling he had already begun to follow them. He did not notice the second envelope, now resting on the lectern where he had been standing earlier. It was addressed simply to the last witness. Would you like me to continue the next chapter so the tension escalates without revealing the solution? That way, the audience remains trapped in suspense. Chapter 2. The Murder Confession. Father Brown reads, "They say the dead cannot write, yet this confession was signed by a man buried 12 years ago." The paper shook faintly in Father Brown's hands, not because of the cold, though the wind clawed at the chapel windows, but because of the name written at the bottom in dark, hurried strokes. He knew that name. Everyone in Kembleford knew it. The trial had been the talk of the county for months, the verdict swift and damning, guilty of murder hanged at dawn, and yet here it was laid bare in front of him, a confession in that same man's own hand, dated not 12 years ago, but 3 days past. The ink was fresh. The signature bled into the fibres as if it had only just dried. It was not a copy, not a forgery. The style, the slant, the pressure of each stroke were identical to samples locked away in the county archives. It was as though the man had risen from his grave, penned his guilt anew, and vanished back into the earth. The confession was not a simple statement of crime. It was a story, a detailed account of a killing that had never been reported, describing a victim no one had known was dead. And the worst part was that the description of the crime scene matched a place Father Brown had walked through only last week, never suspecting what had happened there. As he read further, a creeping sense of unreality took hold. The confession described not just the killing, but the moment after, in words so visceral they clung to the mind. The way the breath had left the victim's lips in a shallow mist, the sound of something small, perhaps a button, rolling away on stone, and the way the killer had looked over his shoulder and seen him. Not a policeman, not a witness, but Father Brown. The confession claimed he had been there, and that he had said nothing. He searched his memory, his conscience, but there was nothing to match. Yet, as he tried to dismiss the thought, a flash of something long buried surfaced. A dim light on a wet road, a figure hurrying away, a shadow falling across his path. Had it been 12 years ago? Or was it last week? The dates felt tangled, impossible to straighten out. The letter did not end there. It warned of another death, one that had not yet occurred. The killer's hand, so confident in the details of the past, now trembled in its prophecy of the future. She will die where the first blood was spilled, and you will see it, as you saw before. A sound from the hallway broke the trance of the words, a floorboard creaking, slow, deliberate. Father Brown folded the confession, slipping it into his pocket. He opened the vestry door and found no one. The hall was empty, though the faint scent of tobacco lingered in the air, the same scent he had noticed on the paper. When he returned to the table, the confession was no longer in his pocket. His hand met only fabric. In its place was a different sheet of paper, blank, save for a single line written in the corner. "You should have burned it." The church bells tolled once, though it was not the hour. The sound made the glass panes tremble, scattering thin webs of light across the stone floor. He stood still, listening. Somewhere beyond the church walls, a carriage wheel ground against the frozen road, stopping abruptly. Then the door at the far end of the nave creaked open inch by inch, as though pushed by a hand too careful to be seen. A woman's voice called his name, soft and strained, as though from a distance. He turned toward it, but the light shifted, and there was no one in the doorway, only a narrow strip of darkness, where the wind moved the air. On the floor just inside lay a small black notebook. He picked it up, feeling the cold of it seep into his skin. It was damp, smelling faintly of soil and iron. The first page was missing, torn out with a violent rip. On the second page, in the same handwriting as the confession, were the words, "The truth is not yours to keep." The rest of the notebook was filled with sketches, places in the village he knew well, the old quarry, the vicarage gate, the steps leading down to the canal. But each sketch had a shadow in it, drawn with such precision that it seemed to shift when viewed from another angle. The shadow was always the same height, always wearing the same hat. It was him. He shut the book quickly, the hairs on his arms rising. The air in the church seemed heavier now, the silence no longer neutral but watchful. He wanted to go to the police to hand over the notebook, but he knew with the same quiet certainty he knew the rites of the Mass, that this was not a case the law could untangle. This was something else, something that threaded the past and present together in a knot only the sender of these messages could cut. He went to the altar rail and found another piece of paper resting there. This one was folded into a small square sealed with red wax. When he broke it, a short message spilled out. "You will read the second confession tonight, and when you do, you will not finish it." His eyes scanned the empty church, but now every shadow seemed capable of holding the one who wrote those words. Somewhere, perhaps outside the window or behind the closed door of the vestry, someone was waiting for him to take the next step. And though every instinct told him to stop, to burn what he had, to close the matter he knew he would not, the bells rang again, twice this time, and the sound seemed to ripple through the air, pressing against his ribs. He gripped the back of a pew to steady himself. It was then he noticed something carved into the wood, deep enough to splinter the grain. "One of us is already dead." The cold seemed to deepen at those words, as though the church itself understood their weight. He wanted to ask, who? But even as the question formed, a knock came at the main door, 3 deliberate strikes, evenly spaced. He crossed the nave, his footsteps echoing. When he opened the door, the street outside was empty. Only a single object lay on the step, an envelope, addressed not to him, but to the witness who stayed silent. Inside was another sheet of paper, this one bearing only a name he knew, a name belonging to someone who was still alive, at least for now. Would you like me to take Chapter 3 even deeper into psychological territory, where Father Brown begins to suspect he is being framed by someone who knows his every move? That would make the mystery even more unbearable for the viewer. Chapter 3. Father Brown uncovers a hidden betrayal. The body was buried in consecrated ground, but the shovel that covered it was held by the victim's own brother. Father Brown had heard confessions that could chill the soul, but this was different. It had not come in the hush of the confessional, nor in the whispered tremor of a guilty voice. This came in the form of a clue so small, so easily overlooked, that he almost missed it. It began with a torn scrap of paper tucked into the hymn, Book of the Third Pew from the front. The paper smelled faintly of damp soil and smoke, as if it had been kept in a place where neither light nor air had touched it for years. Written on it, in a hand he recognized but could not immediately place, were 4 words: "He sleeps among the faithful." At first, the phrase could have meant anything, poetry, a verse, even a random scribble. But as he read it again, the meaning shifted into something heavier. It was not about peaceful rest. It was about hiding something where no one would dare disturb it. Father Brown closed the hymn book slowly, his fingers tracing the indentations left by the pen, and realized the paper had been written recently. Too recently for what it implied. He followed the trail to the churchyard, the frost crunching beneath his feet. The graves were familiar. He had blessed them, prayed over them, remembered the faces of those laid beneath. But one grave drew him in. Not for its appearance, but because it had been moved. Subtle signs, the soil not yet fully settled, the grass patchy, the stones around it slightly disturbed. And when he read the name on the headstone, his chest tightened. It belonged to a man who had died 3 years ago. A quiet, pious man who had no enemies. But something about the disturbed earth told him the coffin did not contain only him. As he stood there, a shadow stretched across the stone. He turned to see a figure watching from the far end of the yard. A tall man with his hat pulled low, a cigarette burning between his fingers. The man didn't move, didn't speak, but the way he stood made it clear. You've found something you shouldn't have. Father Brown looked away for just a moment, and when he looked back, the man was gone. He decided to dig deeper, figuratively, for now. That night, in the vestry, he opened the parish records. Names, dates, births, deaths, but one entry caught his attention. It was an addendum, written in ink. That was slightly different in colour, as though it had been added after the fact. Next to the date of the pious man's death, someone had written a single word: witness. No explanation, no context, just that word. And it wasn't in his handwriting. It was in the looping, controlled script of someone he trusted. Someone close. The more he looked, the more the record books seemed to hum with hidden threads. 2 other entries in the months before the man's death had similar markings, each with the word witness. One of those names belonged to the victim in the 12-year-old murder confession he had read just days ago. The other belonged to someone still alive, someone who sat in the front pew every Sunday without fail. The room felt colder. A sound from the hall, soft, deliberate footsteps, drew his attention. He closed the ledger quickly, but before he could leave the vestry, an envelope slid under the door. He picked it up, and inside was a single photograph, the edges singed. In the photograph, the pious man's grave was open, the coffin lid pushed back. But what was inside the coffin was not a body. It was another coffin, smaller, older, and painted black. And here was the detail that made his breath catch. Carved into the lid of that smaller coffin were 2 initials. They belonged to someone still living. The air seemed to hum with a quiet, expectant tension. Father Brown knew he had stumbled into something not just criminal, but deeply personal. Whoever had placed that second coffin there had not done it in haste. It was deliberate. A message to someone, maybe to him. He sat with the photograph for a long moment, studying the shadows, the angle of the shot. Then it struck him. The photograph had been taken from the balcony of the church, looking down into the graveyard. Whoever took it had been inside the church when it happened. He moved toward the balcony, the boards groaning underfoot. The air smelled faintly of smoke and wax. In the far corner, behind the organ pipes, he found another piece of paper pinned to the wall. This one was a page torn from the parish guest book, the top half burned away. On what remained, a name was written, the same name on the smaller coffin. But beneath it, in smaller, almost trembling letters, were the words, "He knows the truth about the night you lied." The betrayal, when it dawned on him, was not from a stranger. It was from someone whose hand he had shaken. Only hours ago, someone who had smiled as if their conscience were clean. His mind raced with every interaction, every seemingly harmless comment from the past month. The pattern became clearer and more tangled at the same time. This wasn't just about a murder. This was about a chain of events tied together by deception, loyalty, and something older, something rotting quietly under the surface. A noise from below made him freeze. The church doors had opened. He could hear someone moving slowly across the nave, their footsteps stopping directly beneath the balcony. He leaned forward just enough to glimpse the top of a hat, the curve of a shoulder. The figure looked up as if they could feel his eyes, but their face remained hidden in shadow. When he descended, the church was empty, but the main door was ajar, letting in the cold night air. On the steps outside, a small wooden box waited. It was locked with a thin brass clasp. Inside, he found something, wrapped in linen. A silver cross, tarnished and bent, with a dried smear of something dark along the edge. And pinned to the cloth was a single slip of paper. "Forgive me, Father. I did not betray you first." The words hit like a stone to the chest. They didn't just imply guilt. They implied history. Someone he had trusted believed he had betrayed them long before they betrayed him. And the only way to know why would be to uncover the one thing everyone in the village seemed determined to keep buried. The bells rang once in the distance, the sound carrying on the wind. Father Brown closed the box, his mind heavy with questions. Somewhere out there, the person who wrote those words was watching, waiting for him to make his next move. And for the first time, he wondered if following this path would lead to the truth, or to his own grave. Chapter 4. The Letter That Named a Killer. They found the killer's name in a letter written 10 years before the victim was born. Father Brown stared at the page, the ink faded but still legible, the loops of the handwriting sharp and confident. It was no ordinary letter. It had been sealed inside the spine of a family Bible, hidden so well that only the crumbling of the leather had revealed it. The discovery itself was a fluke, made by an old parishioner who'd brought the Bible for repair. But the words it contained had the weight of a death sentence. The letter began without greeting, without preamble, only the stark statement, "If you are reading this, the deed is done." And beneath that line, a single name. Neat, deliberate, unmistakable. The name of a man still alive, living quietly in the village, the same man who had publicly mourned the most recent victim only a week ago. The letter went on, but not in the way one might expect. It didn't describe the candlelight flickering against the yellowed paper. The date at the top of the letter was from over 40 years ago. The man it accused would have been barely a boy when it was written. And yet the handwriting, the details, the confidence, it all pointed to knowledge of a murder that had not yet taken place at the time the letter was penned. A knock at the rectory door startled him. When he opened it, no one was there. Only an envelope lying on the stone step, the paper damp from the night air. Inside was a clipping from the local newspaper dated 3 years ago. The headline read, "Prominent villager clears name in unsolved murder." The article described how the man named in the old letter had been accused, then cleared, in the death of a young woman whose body was never found. The piece ended with a quote from the man himself. "I am not the monster they think I am. I never have been." Father Brown set the clipping down and returned to the letter. There was a strange rhythm to the sentences, an odd structure that made him think of something more than mere correspondence. He tilted the page toward the light and saw faint indentations along the margins, as if another note had once been laid over it and written on, leaving ghostly imprints behind. With the side of a pencil, he shaded the page lightly, and the hidden words emerged. "It will look like an accident. They will never believe you." The unease in his chest deepened. This wasn't just about one killing. It was about a pattern, deaths that could be staged, disguised, and buried beneath layers of plausibility. The man named in the letter might not have acted alone. He might not have acted yet. And the worst possibility was the one Father Brown could not shake. Perhaps the letter had been meant to frame him before the killing ever happened. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made him turn. He called out, but no answer came. The shadows along the walls seemed to thicken. When he stepped into the hall, the air smelled faintly of candle smoke and something metallic, blood perhaps, or old iron. On the table by the door lay another folded sheet of paper. No envelope, no seal, just a single line on the outside. "You have held this before." Inside, the handwriting matched the original letter exactly. But this time, the message was addressed directly to him. "When you speak his name, another will die. Choose wisely." His mind raced. It was a threat, yes, but also a trap. Speak the name and something would happen. Remain silent, and the danger would linger, unseen. The psychological weight of it pressed on him, making the very act of thinking feel dangerous. He folded the paper and put it in his pocket, but his hands were trembling. Later that night, he sat in the dim light of the church, the letter before him, the shadows shifting in the corners. The stillness was almost absolute, broken only by the faint creak of the wooden pews. He was about to put the letter away when he noticed something odd. The ink on the name was darker than the rest of the writing, newer, fresher, as if it had been written much later than the rest of the text. That meant someone had tampered with it. Someone wanted him to believe the accused man was guilty, but the true author of the letter might be someone else entirely. He rose to fetch the parish register, thinking to compare handwriting samples, when the church door groaned open. A figure stepped inside, face hidden in the hood of a dark coat. The figure moved slowly down the aisle, stopping just short of the altar. Without a word, they placed a small box on the front pew and turned to leave. The door closed behind them, the sound echoing through the nave. Father Brown approached the box. It was wooden, the lid held shut by a strip of leather. Inside, wrapped in a length of cloth, was a fountain pen. The nib was stained a deep, permanent black. On the inside of the box's lid, carved with a sharp blade, were the words, "This is the pen that wrote the letter." But there was one more line, smaller, etched in the corner. "And it has written more than one." The implication was a shadow falling across his mind. Whoever had written the letter had written others. Other accusations, other traps, perhaps other names that had led to deaths. If the pattern was true, then the man named in this letter might be as much a victim as the accused before him. The candlelight flickered, and he thought he saw movement in the gallery above. When he looked up, there was nothing, only the stillness of the high rafters. But a moment later, a folded paper fluttered down from the shadows, landing at his feet. It was blank, completely blank. But when he held it near the candle, words appeared in faint, brownish ink. "You have less time than you think." He stood there, the old letter in one hand, the new warning in the other, and felt the walls of the mystery closing in. This wasn't about uncovering a killer. This was about being drawn into a game where the rules changed faster than they could be learned. Somewhere, hidden in the village's quiet streets and familiar faces, was the real author of the letter, the one pulling every string. And yet, as he blew out the candle and let the church sink into darkness, he could not shake the feeling that the killer's name had always been in front of him. The trick was that the name was not the truth. In the silence, his voice was barely a whisper. "I know who wrote it, but I'll never say their name." Chapter 5. Father Brown decodes the final warning. The last warning didn't tell him who would die. It told him who he must let die. Father Brown stared at the scrap of parchment in his hand, the ink smudged and uneven as if the words themselves had resisted being written. It had been slipped under the church door during the night, carried in on a draught that rattled the candle flames. There were only 12 words on the page, but their weight was heavier than any sermon he had ever delivered. You will save the wrong one, and it will damn you. No signature, no flourish, just the cold certainty of a sentence handed down from some unseen court. He read it again, and the implications turned like knives. It wasn't a plea, it wasn't a threat. It was a choice that would be made without knowing which life was the right one to save. He thought of all the faces in the village, of the ones who trusted him, the ones who avoided his gaze. In every eye now, he could imagine the shadow of death. He folded the note and slid it into the pocket of his cassock, feeling it press against his chest like a stone. But there was more. On the back of the parchment, almost invisible in the flicker of candlelight, were faint marks, tiny lines and dots, like the scrawl of someone distracted. Only when he tilted it toward the light did he realize they formed a pattern. Not letters, but a map. The streets of the village, sketched with unnerving accuracy, each building marked in miniature, and on one corner, drawn in red ink so faded it was nearly pink, was an X. He recognized the spot instantly. It was the old mill, abandoned for decades, the roof sagging, the windows dark. A place children dared each other to enter and which adults avoided without ever saying why. Something in the pit of his stomach told him that this was not simply a place on a map. It was the location where the choice in the warning would be made. That night, he walked to the mill under a sky heavy with unbroken clouds. The air smelled of damp stone and something older, something hidden. Inside, the silence was total, broken only by the drip of water somewhere deep in the building. The floorboards groaned under his weight, and dust swirled in the beam of his lantern. Then he saw it. On the far wall, painted in black, the same 12 words from the warning, each letter tall as his hand. But beneath them was something new. 2 names, written in chalk, one beneath the other. The first name was a man he knew to be in the village tonight. The second was a woman who had vanished years ago, presumed dead. The chalk marks were fresh. The air behind him shifted, a faint disturbance that was not quite sound, not quite movement. He turned, but there was nothing. Only the slow sway of a rotted rope hanging from the rafters, as if it had just been touched. He stepped closer to the wall, tracing the chalk with his fingers, and found that the woman's name had been written over another name, one scraped away so violently that the plaster beneath was gouged. His mind raced. Someone had rewritten this warning, changed it, but why? To protect one person? To condemn another? The possibilities twisted in on themselves. He thought again of the words, "You will save the wrong one." If the names were the choice, then the true victim might already be decided, and his part in it was only to ensure that it looked like fate. Yet, the corner of the mill, he found another message, scratched into the floorboards with something sharp. "You've seen this before." The letters were jagged, splintered at the edges, and as he read them, a memory surfaced. Years ago, in another parish, another unsolved death, he had received a note with those same words. That case had ended in silence, the truth buried not just in the ground, but in the minds of those who had lived through it. Now it was back, and the repetition was no accident. As he left the mill, the wind carried a sound that stopped him mid-step, a faint, rhythmic tapping like knuckles against wood. He followed it to the edge of the riverbank, where an old fishing boat was tied to the dock. On the seat of the boat lay an envelope sealed with black wax. Inside, a single slip of paper bore the outline of a hand, each fingertip marked with a number. 5 numbers in all. At the bottom, in the same ink as the warning, were the words, "This is how. You'll choose." He returned to the rectory, the paper heavy in his hand. What could the numbers mean? Dates, times, ages? He spread it on his desk beside the map, the chalk names still etched in his memory. The numbers seemed random, until he noticed they matched entries in the parish register. Births, christenings, deaths, all connected to one family. A family that had splintered years ago under the weight of suspicion and whispered scandal. One name stood out. It belonged to someone he saw every Sunday, someone who had never missed a mass. And yet, according to the register, that person had died, officially, 20 years ago. The knock at his door was soft, almost hesitant. He opened it to find no one there, only a candle burning in a brass holder, left on the stone step. The flame guttered in the wind, casting long shadows. Tied to the base of the candle was a ribbon, and attached to it, a final slip of paper. It was blank at first, but when he held it to the candlelight, words bled up from the fibres. "You've already made your choice." His breath caught. If the choice had already been made, then the game was no longer about deciding, it was about realizing what decision he had already taken without knowing it. He thought back over the past weeks, the conversations, the small acts of kindness, the subtle dismissals. Somewhere in all of that, he had tipped the balance toward one name on the wall and away from the other. The church bell, tolled once in the distance, though no one had pulled the rope. He glanced at the clock, 11:46, the same time marked on the pocket watch he had been given weeks ago, the one linked to another death. The pattern was complete, but its meaning slipped through his fingers like smoke. And then, in the stillness, he heard it. A voice, close enough to be in the room with him, low and certain. "You will know at midnight." He turned, but the room was empty. Only the candle flickered, its flame bending as though someone had just passed by. He looked again at the warning, the map, the handprint with its numbered fingers, and realized that every clue had been placed not to help him solve the mystery, but to make him complicit in it. He sat in the dark, the weight of the decision pressing on him. Midnight was coming, and with it, the truth he might never be able to speak. And when it came, he would either save the wrong one or find that he already had. Chapter 6. The secret letter that doomed her. They say no letter can kill, but this one arrived an hour before she was found dead, and it was written by her own hand. The paper trembled slightly between Father Brown's fingers, not because of the chill in the vestry, but because the ink on it was still wet. He had been called to the house under the pretense of offering comfort to the grieving, but what waited for him on the mantelpiece was far from an innocent keepsake. The envelope bore no seal, only a hurried scrawl of the victim's name across the front, and the loops and curves of the handwriting were unmistakable. She had written it herself, but the contents were something no living woman would pen about her own death. Inside, in small, deliberate lines, she had written a confession, not to a crime, but to an inevitability. "By the time you read this, I will be gone. This is not an end I chose, but one I accepted." The words seemed to shrink the air in the room, to draw it closer around him. The letter named no killer, offered no scene, no reason. Instead, it hinted at a promise kept too long. A debt called in. And in the final lines, almost too faint to see, she had written, "I have hidden the truth where he will never think to look." It was those last words that pulled at him. The he could be anyone, the murderer, a blackmailer, a lover. The tone made it sound like she was writing not to the world, but to one particular man. And that man was supposed to find the letter after it was too late. But somehow, it had found its way into Father Brown's hands instead. He turned the letter over, searching for impressions, for signs of another note written beneath it. And there they were, faint grooves, like the ghost of a second message pressed into the paper. When he held it to the light, fragments revealed themselves. A name, part of an address, the beginning of a date. But before he could make them out fully, a shadow passed the doorway. The hallway outside was empty. Only the slow tick of the grandfather clock reached his ears. Yet on the table by the door sat another envelope, identical to the first. This one was sealed in red wax, unbroken. When he opened it, there was no letter inside, only a pressed white flower, brittle with age, and a small scrap of fabric torn from a dress. The dress was familiar. It belonged to the same one she had been wearing the last time he saw her alive. The fabric was stained with something dark but not blood. It was ink, deep, black ink, the kind used in the parish registers. Someone had written over the cloth, but the words were incomplete, as if half had been cut away. What remained read, "Did not die alone." The weight of it pressed down on him. If she hadn't died alone, then someone had been with her at the very moment she drew her last breath. Someone who had chosen silence over confession. He thought of the men and women who had gathered in. The house tonight. The way some had averted their eyes. The way others had looked too directly at him, as if daring him to speak first. He slipped the letter and the fabric into his pocket and left without announcing his departure. The streets were silent, the kind of silence that feels like it's listening. At the rectory, he laid the items on his desk. The ink on the fabric seemed to shimmer under the lamplight, and slowly, faint shapes emerged. Letters that had been hidden in the weave. He made out 3 of them, but no more before the light dimmed under a sudden gust that rattled the windows. That was when he saw the movement in the corner. A figure stood there, so still it seemed part of the shadow itself. The face was hidden, but in one gloved hand was another envelope. Without a word, the figure stepped forward, placed it on the desk, and retreated into the darkness. By the time Father Brown reached the door, the street outside was empty. The new envelope contained only a small card with a single sentence written in a sharp, angular hand. "You opened the wrong letter." His heart tightened. If that was true, then the first letter, the one in her handwriting, was never meant for him, and perhaps never meant for anyone outside the arrangement she hinted at, which meant someone else still held the real message, the one that could damn or save whoever he was. He read the sentence again and again, each time hearing it in a different voice, in the whisper of the wind, in the creak of the pews, in the echo of the victim's own speech. The meaning shifted with each reading. Was it a warning, a taunt, or a plea to look deeper? The bells of the church began to toll midnight, slow and deliberate. And with each strike, he thought he heard another sound layered beneath them, the faint tearing of paper. Somewhere, someone was destroying evidence. When the last bell fell silent, the candle on his desk guttered out. In the darkness, his fingers found the torn scrap of fabric again. He turned it over, and this time, under the faint light of the moon through the window, he saw something he hadn't before. A small mark embroidered in the corner. Not a letter, but a symbol. A cross with a single tear-shaped drop beneath it. He had seen it once before, carved into the wood of an unmarked grave at the edge of the cemetery. The memory struck him hard. That grave had been dug in secret years ago under cover of a storm. No name, no ceremony, only the mark, and the knowledge that the one buried there had been removed from the parish records entirely. Whoever lay in that grave had been erased, and now their symbol had appeared in the belongings of the newest victim. The pieces began to form an outline, but not a picture. If he was right, this was not one crime, but the continuation of something older, a chain of silences, each link forged by a death that had to look like fate. And now, by holding the wrong letter, he might have stepped into the place of the next link. From outside came the sound of footsteps, deliberate and unhurried, stopping just beyond his door. A moment later, something slid beneath it. A third envelope. This one bore no name, no seal, just a line scrawled in black. You are already too late. He didn't open it right away. Instead, he sat in the dark, listening to the retreating steps fade into the distance. When at last he broke the flap, a single sheet fell into his hand. On it was a drawing of the church, his church, but the tower was burning, flames licking the spire, and in one of the windows, a silhouette stood watching. His own silhouette. Somewhere deep inside, he knew what it meant. The truth would not be found in the letters he held, but in the one letter he had never seen. The one still out there, passing from hand to hand, its words sharpening like a blade, and when it reached the person it was meant for, it would do. What no knife or poison could do, it would kill. Chapter 7. Father Brown reads a death sentence. The letter did not accuse, did not threaten. It simply told him the exact day and hour he would die. It lay on the vestry table folded once, the paper heavy and grainy as though it had been handmade for this singular purpose. There was no address, no signature, only his name written in a hand so precise. It felt deliberate, like a surgeon making the first incision. When he opened it, his eyes locked on the first line. Reverend Brown, your life will end at 12:46 a.m., 3 nights from now. There was no flourish, no drama, just the unshakable certainty of someone who did not deal in guesses. Beneath that, in smaller, tighter script, the words, "This is not a threat. It is a fact." For a long moment, he simply stared at it. Facts could be debated, twisted, broken apart, but this had the cold authority of something already decided. The rest of the letter was a strange mixture of ritual and record, a list of seemingly random events from his own life, each marked with a date and time, each rendered with eerie accuracy down to the colour of the tie he had worn on a certain Sunday 15 years ago. At the bottom, there was a single sentence in red ink. Every moment has led to this one. The strangest part was not the content, it was the handwriting. He knew it. He had seen it in the parish register, in thank you notes, in the margins of hymn books. It belonged to someone who had died 6 years ago. He folded the letter, but even in his pocket, it felt like it was still open, still speaking. Who had written it? How had they known such details? And why him? Why now? He tried to think logically, to find the edges of the puzzle, but each possibility led to another question. That night, the air in the rectory felt heavier, the silence less like peace and more like a weight pressing in from all sides. He set the letter on his desk and began comparing it to old samples of the handwriting he remembered. The matches were exact. The loops on the G, the slant of the T, the way the ink pooled at the start of each word. Identical. Which meant one of two things. Someone had forged it with perfect skill, or someone who should be long dead had written it themselves. There was a knock at the door. When he opened it, there was no one, only a small package resting on the stone step. Inside was a pocket watch, stopped at 12:46, and a scrap of black ribbon. The watch's glass was cracked, the metal cold and damp to the touch. Beneath it lay another note, written in the same hand. This is the time you will stop. He felt a prickling at the back of his neck. The ribbon was not just a piece of cloth. It was a funeral ribbon, the kind tied to the handles of coffins in the old custom. Someone was not only predicting his death, but preparing for it. The next day, he took the letter and the watch to the church, locking the doors behind him. He laid them on the altar, hoping the sanctity of the place might strip them of their power. But when he turned away, the sound of ticking filled the air. He spun back. The watch was moving, the second hand twitching forward, counting the time toward the appointed hour. He reached for it, but before his hand could touch the glass, the ticking stopped. In the silence that followed, he heard something else, a faint scratching, as if a pen were writing somewhere in the church. He followed the sound to the vestry. On the wall, in dark ink that was still wet, someone had written the date and time from the letter. Beneath it, a single word. Confirmed. The ink was fresh, but the vestry was empty. The window was locked from the inside. Whoever had done this had been there only moments before, yet left no sign of their exit. That night, he lay awake, the letter on the table beside his bed. Just past midnight, the church bells rang once. He sat up, listening. A moment later, he heard footsteps in the hall outside his room. Slow, unhurried. The boards creaked under each step. When he opened the door, the hallway was empty, but another note had been slid under it. This one was different. The handwriting was jagged, rushed. If you wish to live, save her instead. No name, no explanation. Just the implicit promise that someone else's life was now bound to his own. If he saved her, whoever she was, did that mean he would escape his fate? Or would it only hasten it? The clock on the wall ticked louder in the silence, each second drawing him toward the hour written in that first, terrible letter. Somewhere in the village, a woman he might not even know was walking toward her own death. And somewhere else, someone was watching both of them, keeping count. The night wind rose, rattling the panes. From the churchyard came the muffled toll of a bell, 3 short chimes, then silence. He went to the window and saw nothing but darkness, the frost, silver on the stones. But in the morning, carved into the snow by the gate, he found the same message as the letter, etched with precision. 12:46. It was no longer just a warning. It was a clock winding down. And he could feel it inside him now, in the way his own heartbeat seemed to keep time with it, each beat a step closer to the moment someone, somewhere, had already decided would be his last. Chapter 8. The Hidden Truth Buried in Ink. They said the letter was harmless, until the words that killed her began to appear hours after she had read it. Father Brown had seen many kinds of writing in his time, love letters, death threats, confessions scrawled in trembling hands, but this one was unlike anything else. It was a page that seemed to grow heavier each time he looked at it, as though the paper itself knew what it contained. At first, it was nearly blank, with only a few neat lines written in black ink. But the witness who brought it to him swore that the page had been covered in words when it was first read by the dead woman, and those words had driven her to tears before she left the room for the last time. Now they were gone, or almost gone. He tilted it toward the lamplight, and that's when he saw them, shadows of letters, faint but real, as if the ink had sunk beneath the surface and was waiting for permission to come back. There were gaps, missing, phrases, unfinished sentences like half-heard whispers in the dark, and in those gaps, his mind began to imagine the rest. The paper had been found hidden in the lining of her handbag, tucked beneath a false bottom. No one had known it was there until after her death, and no one could explain how it had been written in her own handwriting. That was the first impossibility. The second was the date, marked neatly at the top in the same ink. It was from 3 years ago, a time when she had been far from the village and in no contact with the people now under suspicion. He ran his fingers along the edge of the page and felt something uneven, almost like tiny ridges beneath the surface. They weren't creases. They were impressions, layers of other writing pressed into the fibers, hidden from casual sight. He fetched a candle, holding the flame close without burning the paper, and slowly, more words began to surface. They were written at odd angles, upside down, in different sizes, as though the page had been reused again and again for messages no one was meant to read twice. One sentence stood out among them, written larger than the rest. "You will not be the last." The air in the rectory thickened. This wasn't simply a letter, it was a record, a layered confession that belonged to more than one voice. It was as if each hand that had held the paper had left its mark in ink, and some of those hands belonged to people long dead. In the margin, almost, hidden in the curl of a decorative flourish, he spotted something even stranger. A series of tiny numbers, written so small they looked like specks. He copied them onto another sheet, and they formed a date and time, 2 days from now, just after midnight. Before he could think further, there was a knock at the door. When he opened it, no one stood there, only a small glass bottle on the step, filled with black ink, so thick it seemed to swallow the light. A scrap of paper was tied to the neck with twine. On it, in cramped letters, was the phrase, "Use this and you'll see." He placed the bottle beside the letter and dipped his pen. As the fresh ink touched the page, the rest of the hidden words bled to the surface as though they had been waiting for it. Lines appeared in rapid succession, twisting and turning across the sheet, forming sentences that were impossible to ignore. They spoke of an agreement, of a betrayal buried so deep that the only way to keep it hidden was to pass the truth in plain sight, disguised as an ordinary letter. One line made his skin crawl. "He will not forgive you for what happened at the grave." There was no explanation, no name, but he knew which grave they meant. The unmarked one at the far end of the cemetery, the one villagers avoided without saying why. He remembered standing by it once years ago, feeling the strange pressure of eyes on his back, though the yard had been empty. Now, seeing those words, he was certain that, whoever had written them had been there too. And if they had been watching him then, they could have been watching him all along. The rest of the page seemed to pulse with meaning, but just as he reached the bottom, the ink began to fade again. The words blurred, dissolving back into the paper as though they had been alive and had decided to hide once more. In their place, new words appeared, written in a harsher, heavier hand. "Stop reading, or she dies sooner." He froze. It was no longer a relic of the past. It was now a live threat, one that could be acted on in real time. Somewhere there was a she who mattered to the writer, or perhaps mattered to him, and whoever held the other half of this correspondence was in control. A sound behind him broke the spell, a soft tap against the window. He turned quickly, but there was nothing outside except the drifting fog. When he faced the desk again, the bottle of ink was gone. In its place was a smaller piece of paper, folded once with a fresh line of writing in that same heavy hand. "You've read enough to be guilty." The words settled over him like a verdict. If he had seen too much, then the trap had already been sprung. He knew now that this wasn't a puzzle meant to be solved. It was an invitation into someone else's crime, and by accepting it, he had taken their place in whatever plan was unfolding. The candle flickered, casting long shadows over the page. Somewhere in those shadows was the answer, but the more he stared, the less certain he became that he wanted to find it. And yet, the letter remained in front of him, waiting, the last faint lines of ink whispering from the depths. "You were never meant to survive this." Chapter 9. Father Brown faces the killer's revenge. They didn't try to kill him with a bullet or a blade. They tried to kill him with the truth he had buried years ago. The first note arrived without a sound, slid under the rectory door in the dead of night. It wasn't a threat in the usual sense, no crude warnings, no violent imagery. It was a single line written in a hand he recognized instantly, a hand he had last seen wrapped around a prison cell key 12 years ago. It's my turn to hear your confession. Father Brown read it 3 times, each repetition colder than the last. The man who had written it had sworn vengeance the day the noose was spared him by a last-minute appeal. That man had vanished soon after, swallowed by the world's shadows. Now he was back. At first, there was no visible attack, no crime to investigate, just a presence. It began with the sensation of being watched, the long shadow across the cobblestones when he left evening prayers, the faint creak of the rectory's front step when no one knocked. Each time he looked, the street was empty. But the feeling lingered, as steady as a heartbeat. Then came the small disruptions. The parish register pages turned to the wrong entries, the candles in the chapel lit before he arrived, the unmistakable smell of tobacco curling in the air where no one had smoked. One night, as he returned from a visit to the cemetery, the rectory door was ajar. Inside, nothing seemed out of place, until he reached his study. On his desk lay a neatly folded paper, the ink still damp. It wasn't written to him directly, but about him, as though he had stumbled upon someone's diary entry. It detailed his movements that day with impossible precision, the number of steps he had taken between the church gate and the rectory door, the exact words he had spoken to Mrs. Keating at the market, even the way his hand had hesitated over the last page of a book before he closed it. At the bottom was a simple sentence. I see you hesitate when you remember her. Her. There was only one her that could mean. Years ago, she had been the reason for the trial that never quite ended, the witness who vanished before the final verdict, the ghost whose absence left a hole in the truth. He had spoken of her to no one, yet here her memory was, resurrected in the ink of someone who wanted him to bleed through his own conscience. The pressure grew. Each day brought another page, sometimes slipped into his coat pocket while he was wearing it, sometimes folded into the hymn book he opened on Sunday morning. The pages were always the same, intimate observations of his private moments, laced with references to things he thought no one knew. It was a stalking that used memory as a weapon, and the more he read, the more he began to doubt the solidity of his own past. Then came the turning point. One night he found an envelope on the altar. Inside was a photograph, grainy, black and white, showing him standing over a grave in the rain. He remembered the day, but not the moment captured in the image. In the photograph, his hand was reaching into the open earth, holding something he could not quite see. Scribbled on the back was a line, "You took it from me." The memory refused to surface, and yet the guilt came as if he had known all along. He began combing through old parish records, burial logs, letters tucked away in drawers that smelled of dust and time. What he found only deepened the darkness. An entry struck through with such force it had torn the page, a name removed but not cleanly enough to hide the outline of the letters beneath. The letters matched the name of the man who had sent the first note. It dawned on him then. The revenge wasn't about killing him outright. It was about making him reveal something that had been buried alongside the truth of that trial. Each step he took toward understanding was another step into the trap the killer had laid years in advance. The final message arrived on a cold, still night, pinned to the church door with a rusted nail. Tomorrow you'll stand where I stood, and you'll understand why I laughed in court. No time, no place, just the certainty that he would know it when it happened. The handwriting was steady, calm, almost amused. He carried that note in his pocket all night, and it seemed to burn there, growing heavier with each passing hour. At dawn, a knock came, not at the door but at the window. He opened it to find no one, only the faintest trace of tobacco smoke curling into the morning air. On the sill lay another folded paper, this one smaller than the rest. Inside there were no words, only a single drop of dried blood in the center and the faint impression of a fingerprint pressed into it. He stared at it, the silence of the room pressing in around him. Somewhere out there, the killer was waiting. Not for him to run, not for him to fight, but for him to remember. And in that moment, he realized the most terrifying part of the revenge wasn't what the killer would do to him. It was what the killer had already made him see about himself. He looked once more at the photograph of the grave, at his own blurred hand reaching into the earth, and whispered the words he knew he could never speak aloud to anyone else. "I know who you are." But in the stillness that followed, another truth coiled in the shadows. Just as certain, just as final, the killer knew him better. Chapter 10. The letter that changed his fate. The letter didn't threaten his life. It rewrote it, line by line, until nothing he remembered was truly his own. Father Brown found it on the altar, not lying carelessly, but placed with the precision of a holy relic, its edges aligned perfectly with the grain of the wood. The envelope was the color of old bone, sealed with black wax stamped in the shape of a key. There was no name, no address, just the faint scent of candle smoke and something metallic. He broke the seal, and the paper inside crackled faintly, like it had been folded for decades and only now released. The opening line hit like a blow. "Father Brown, you do not belong here." It was followed by an account of his own life, birthplace, schooling, ordination, but with small, deliberate alterations. The town of his childhood was different. The name of his mentor was wrong. The date of his first Mass moved by 2 years. Each change was slight enough to pass, unnoticed if he hadn't lived those moments himself, but together they formed something unsettling, a version of him that wasn't him. At first, he thought it a cruel joke, some strange attempt to shake him, but the further he read, the more the letter seemed to lean into its power. It described events from his past that had never happened, yet with such precision that for a moment he doubted his own memory. A trip to the coast where he had supposedly spoken to a dying woman. A night inn, a small inn where he had received a visitor who left before dawn. And then, more disturbingly, it described conversations he had had, but with words altered, reshaped, until their meaning was reversed. By the third page, the letter was no longer recounting the past. It was dictating the present. It told him to walk to the graveyard at sunset, to stand before an unmarked grave for exactly 5 minutes, and to touch the stone with his left hand. And then it told him what would happen if he obeyed. "When you return, you will find the truth waiting for you." There was a chill in the church, though no wind blew. The letter did not beg or warn, it commanded, and the authority in its tone was not human. He folded it slowly, his fingers trembling, and slipped it into his coat. That evening, the sky burned low with the orange of a dying sun, the light fractured by bare branches. He walked to the graveyard, each step feeling heavier than the last. The unmarked grave was there, just as the letter had described. Its stone weathered smooth, the earth beneath it dark and sunken. He placed his left hand on the stone, the cold biting through his glove. For 5 minutes he stood in silence, counting the seconds, feeling the strange certainty that someone stood just out of sight, watching. When he returned to the rectory, the truth was waiting, just as the letter had promised. On his desk lay another envelope, identical to the first, but this time unsealed. Inside was a single page that read, "You have taken his place." No explanation, no context, just those words, and beneath them, a date, 10 years in the past, and a name he had never heard before. Yet the name stirred something in him, a flicker of recognition that he could not place. He searched the parish records, the archives, even the old newspapers in the library, but the name appeared only once in a short obituary. No details, no cause of death, only the words, "Survived by no one." It was impossible, yet the more he looked, the more gaps he found in his own memory. Weeks that seemed hazy, names he couldn't recall. And then the photograph appeared. It was slipped under his door in the early hours, the paper damp with morning fog. In the photograph, he was standing beside a coffin, his hand resting on its lid. But it wasn't him. Not exactly. The man in the picture had his face, his cassock, his posture, but there was something different in the eyes. On the back, in the same hand as the letters, was a single line. "The one you replaced wants his life back." The air in the room felt too close, the shadows stretching farther than they should. He thought of the grave, of the name in the obituary, and of the possibility, unthinkable yet undeniable, that his life was not entirely his own. That somewhere in the spaces between memory and reality, someone else had been erased to make room for him. He tried to burn the letters that night, but the flames refused to catch. The paper curled and blackened at the edges, yet the words remained visible, stubbornly intact, as though the ink itself clung to the page in defiance. In the silence, he thought he heard the faint scratching of a pen. And then, on his desk, a new letter appeared. He could swear it had not been there seconds before. This one was shorter than the rest. It read, "We are almost finished writing you." He stared at it for a long time, his pulse echoing in his ears. The implication was clear. His fate was not just being told, it was being edited. And when the last word was written, whatever life he thought he owned might vanish, as easily as a line crossed out in ink. Chapter 11. Father Brown finds a murder map. The map didn't show streets or landmarks. It showed the exact places where the next 3 bodies would fall. It was folded so many times that it fit neatly into the palm of his hand, the edges soft from years of handling. Father Brown found it in the most unsettling of places, slipped inside the back cover of an old hymn book, the one he kept locked away for services long past. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than a child's rough sketch, lines drawn in uneven charcoal across yellowed paper. But as he opened it fully under the lamplight, the details emerged. Shapes of buildings, crooked paths, strange symbols in red that almost looked like drops of blood. There were no names on the buildings, no identifying marks of a town. But the longer he stared, the more his mind began to arrange the shapes into something familiar. The curves in the path weren't random. They matched the bend in the river just outside the village. The cluster of rectangles could only be the marketplace. And then the realization came cold and sudden. The 3 red marks were not random dots. They sat exactly where 3 people had been murdered in the past year. Each crime had been declared separate by the police, different causes, no shared suspects. But here, on this map, they were connected, bound together by some hidden design. And worse, a 4th mark sat on the edge of the page, far from the others. It wasn't a place where any body had been found. Not yet. He traced the lines with a gloved finger, feeling the faint grooves where the charcoal had bitten into the paper. There was a rhythm to the marks, a pattern that hinted at order beneath the chaos. But the more he tried to understand, the more questions surfaced. Who had drawn it? Why keep it hidden in a hymn book? And why did it feel as though the 4th mark was waiting for something or someone? As he examined the map, he noticed faint letters written along the margins, so light they were almost invisible. He tilted the paper towards the flame and read them. "They will not die where they are buried." The phrase twisted in his mind, pulling at something he didn't want to think about. It implied movement, bodies taken from where they fell, perhaps placed somewhere else entirely, which meant the crimes themselves were only part of a larger plan. He needed to know if the fourth mark was meant for the future, or if it had already claimed someone unseen. That night, under the cover of darkness, he walked the path that led to the spot the mark indicated. It was deep in the woods, where the trees grew close and the air held the damp scent of earth and decay. At the center of the clearing was a patch of ground where the grass grew differently, sparse, brittle, as though something beneath it had poisoned the soil. He knelt, brushing away leaves, and found the corner of a torn cloth, the faded pattern of a dress. His heart tightened. The cloth was still damp, though no rain had fallen in days. He didn't dig deeper. Not yet. Instead, he marked the spot in his mind and returned to the church. Back in the vestry, he unfolded the map again and froze. A fifth mark had appeared on the paper, as if drawn by an invisible hand while it lay in his pocket. This one was nowhere near the village. It was in the sea. The shape of the coastline was unmistakable. He had barely processed the meaning when a knock sounded at the church door. The sound echoed through the empty nave. When he opened it, there was no one, only another folded sheet of paper resting on the step. Inside was a message written in the same hand as the faint letters on the map. The map is not finished. The words gnawed at him. If it wasn't finished, then the marks were still being added, and the killer was still working. Somewhere out there, someone knew when and where the next death would happen, and they had chosen to let him see the pattern. And then, as he placed the note beside the map, he noticed something he hadn't before. The paper of the map was not ordinary. It was layered, 2 sheets pressed together. He worked the corner loose, peeling them apart. Beneath the top sheet was another drawing, faint but distinct. It showed the same village, but with entirely different marks. Marks that matched the locations of people who were still alive. The implication was chilling. The Seine. First map showed where the dead had fallen. The second showed where the living would die. And among those names circled in the faintest red was his own. Chapter 12. The Dead's letter reveals a conspiracy. They buried him 6 months ago, but tonight his letter arrived, naming the men who would kill again if no one stopped them. Father Brown had seen death bring closure before, but this letter tore closure apart like paper in the wind. It lay on his desk now, the envelope stiff with age, yet marked with the day's postmark, an impossibility that made the hairs rise on his arms. The handwriting was unmistakably the same as in the parish. Marriage register, the same as on the man's last will, a man whose funeral Father Brown himself had conducted. He broke the seal, half expecting the page to crumble, but it was pristine. The ink was dark, steady, as if it had been written yesterday. The first lines were chilling in their calmness. By the time you read this, they will already have replaced me. My death was not an ending. It was the clearing of a seat at the table. No names yet, no direct accusations, but the implication was cold and precise. It spoke of a group, not a lone murderer. A group with the power to remove and replace people as easily as changing the locks on a door. The next lines turned even darker. What we began in the light is now completed in shadow. You have seen their faces. You have shaken their hands. You trust them. He read on, the words tightening like a noose around his mind. There were hints of secret meetings, of decisions made behind the doors of ordinary places. The church vestry, the back room of the grocer's, the quiet corner of the train station waiting room. The letter described these locations as if they were pieces on a chessboard, each one holding a move that led to another death. And then it dropped the first bomb. Your name was on the list, but I took it off. He sat back, staring at that sentence, the ink pressing into his eyes. Whoever they were, they had planned to kill him. And if the writer had indeed protected him once, there was no guarantee they would do so again. The letter continued, the tone shifting to something more urgent. If you are reading this, it means the map is nearly complete. You have found some of the marks. You will think they are connected by the dead, but they are not. They are connected by the living, the ones no one suspects. His thoughts flashed to the murder map he had discovered weeks ago, to the red marks, the unmarked graves, the names still alive but circled in faint red. A sudden sound broke his concentration, a soft thud at the rectory door. He opened it to find no one there but a parcel wrapped in plain brown paper rested on the step. Inside was an old parish ledger, the kind used for recording tithes. At first it seemed ordinary, until he noticed that certain names had been underlined in red ink. All of them were people he had seen recently, still alive. And in the margins next to 3 of them, there was a date, 2 days from now. He brought the ledger back to the desk and laid it beside the letter. That's when he noticed something that stopped his breath. The handwriting in the margins of the ledger matched the handwriting of the letter, which meant the dead man had not only written the warning, he had updated the ledger after his death. Or someone who wanted him to think so had done it. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. He picked up the letter again and turned it over. On the back, in fainter ink, there was a final set, instructions. Do not go to the place marked in the sea. They will be waiting for you there. If you go, the choice will no longer be yours. His mind reeled. The map's 5th mark, the one in the sea, had been haunting him. Now the letter warned him away from it entirely. But why? What was there that could remove even the illusion of choice? The church bell struck midnight, a sound that usually brought peace but now sounded like a countdown. He folded the letter, slipped it into his pocket, and decided to lock it away in the vestry. But when he entered, his heart stopped. On the vestry table lay another envelope, this one unsealed. Inside was a single sentence, written in the same hand. You've already been there. A rush of images filled his mind, standing on a cliff's edge, the sea roaring below, a rowboat swaying on the dark water. He had been there, weeks ago in the middle of the night, summoned by an unsigned note. But he had told no one. The memory was hazy, like a dream slipping away, but now it felt as if someone else had been with him. And then came the final blow. Beneath the envelope on the vestry table was a folded sheet of the same parchment as the original letter. He opened it with slow, deliberate care and read the words that would not leave him for the rest of his life. The conspiracy does not end with them. It ends with you. Somewhere in the dark, a floorboard creaked. He turned sharply, but the vestry was empty. The only sound was the faint whisper of the sea in his mind and the unshakable truth that whoever had written from beyond the grave, or pretended to, had just made him the final piece of the game. He closed his eyes and said aloud, though no one was there to hear it, I know who did it, but the truth will never be told.